Hey, I've been in the Monster Hunter mood recently, and I've been wanting to make a diorama. I've been wanting to do something with one of my favorite monsters, the Brachydios. I start by rough sketching the layout. I plan on having crystals and bones lining his path in a volcanic trench. I started by 3D printing the first Brachydios model I found off Thingiverse. I'll leave the file in the description. Before we can see his beautiful face, we have to break off all the supports. And unfortunately, I couldn't find my good pliers, so I was stuck with the terrible ones. He had a few imperfections, but that just means he's going to need a bit more work. I used a hobby knife to scrape away some of the imperfections, and there was quite a lot of them. Unfortunately, 2 of his spikes fell off, and I'll have to reattach them later. He has a print line that goes across his whole face, which I'll have to fill in. I'm using some spot putty to fill in all of the imperfections. This stuff helps to smooth everything over. The Brachydios was the flagship monster for Monster Hunter 3 Ultimate, released all the way back in 2011. He is classified as a brute wyvern with highly developed forearms, and uses an explosive slime mold as his defense mechanism. Now that he's all puttied up, it's almost time to smooth him out. I almost forgot to reattach his spikes, which luckily I do before sanding. It took forever to get the superglue out of the bottle. Once I did, the spikes were finally reattached. Now that he's all patched up, I'm going to clean up my workspace and then we can start sanding. I like to sand him very lightly and use a low grit sandpaper because I don't want to smooth out all of the details. I'm trying out a new video style like this, so let me know if you'd like to see more. The feedback really helps out. I mainly tried to focus on his head because it needed the most work. Once I clean him up, he should be smooth and ready for priming. Now, it's time for the base. My main inspiration for the base comes from the Elder's Recess in Monster Hunter World. I start by arranging the foam until I see a design that I like. I couldn't make up my mind on how I wanted them to lay out, but eventually I landed on a design. In the past, I printed out some Skyrim soul gems. These would work great as the crystals, considering I have no use for them right now. Using a box cutter, I start carving into the foam. I carve all the foam pieces until they somewhat resemble rocks. If you're wondering what foam I'm using, it's called XPS foam. It's the foam that insulates your walls. You could find it at any local hardware store. I have a couple of decent looking rock shapes, but I'm gonna need a little bit more. I got a bigger foam sheet from out of my garage. I plan on cutting this into 4 sections and stacking it up like a wedding cake. Let me know what you would like me to build next. I was thinking of making a From Software diorama, like Elden Ring or Dark Souls, but you guys let me know. XPS foam takes texture really well, but I'm not texturing it because I'm just going to cover it with plaster. I can now glue all of the segments together, and then to the base. The Brachydios doesn't just use its slime for combat, it also uses it to mark its territory and serve as a warning for other monsters. And the large horn on its head isn't only for combat either. It's incredibly durable and used to break rocks or any obstacles in its path. In-game, the Brachydios has a 3-star weakness to ice and a 2-star weakness to water, but it has a complete immunity to fire attacks. Its slime comes from symbiotic microorganisms on its body, which secrete a sticky mucus that detonates when exposed to oxygen, turning its punches into fiery explosions. If you plan on using a hot glue gun to bind your foam pieces, make sure to have it on the low temperature setting, otherwise the glue will melt right through it and not bond correctly. Now that we have some decent looking formations, it's time to attach them to the base. The base I'm using is a paper-backed foam board that I cut to size. I removed the paper from one side of the board for the hot glue to have a stronger bond. At this stage, the main structure of the base is formed. This will serve as the foundation to build everything up. Another important element of this project are the skeletal remains of dead monsters lining this trench. These bones came from those animal skeletons at the dollar store that they sell around Halloween. I'm trimming up the bones to look more natural and less intact. This bone came from the back of one of those horribly inaccurate spider skeletons. This next one is from a crow skeleton, and I'm going to separate the legs into segments so that I could have more variety. There are 2 screw holes in this rib cage, so I'm just going to cut around them to have more realistic shapes. Now, it's time to apply the plaster sheets. I grabbed a container of water for soaking the strips, and I'll need to cut this roll into a few medium sheets. I grabbed some fabric scissors to start cutting. I cut slightly varying sizes that I could layer on top of each other. This larger one will be used to connect both of the hills. If you're unfamiliar with how plaster cloth works, it's similar to paper mache. You dip them in water and then you apply them wherever is needed. It says to leave them overnight to dry, but if you place it in front of a fan, it should be dry in a few hours. Draping these sheets over the foam will help it to smooth out the sharp corners and make the landscape appear more natural. Now that the foam surface is covered, it's time to apply some texture. For this, I'm going to mix up some leftover water with some plaster powder. I mix it up with my hands until it has a consistency of thick mud. I cover everything with the paste until it has a grout texture. I have to work quick because this stuff dries really fast. I mixed in some sand to enhance the look. Now I'm going to apply some Mod Podge to lock everything in. I make sure to coat every surface because I don't want anything flaking off. I then applied some extra sand in the low points of the rock, where sand would naturally collect. I threw in a couple of larger pebbles for variety. So far, it's looking good. I can now glue down all the crystals and bones. I glued down the crystals, but ended up taking them off after to paint separately. But I did end up finding an arrangement that I liked. I tried to scatter the bones around evenly in places that seemed the most realistic. And now, everything is coming together, and I could hit this base with some primer. And now, we could finally start painting Brachydios. I use my airbrush for a majority of the paint job. I start with white ink from Liquitex to highlight all of his raised surfaces. This technique will make the other colors I apply to him more vibrant on the raised surfaces and shaded in the recesses. I make sure to hit all of his most prominent features. You can use this technique to add depth or highlights to anything. Now, we have a good base for the paints to sit on. Next, I like to accentuate the shadows with Hive Dweller Purple Speed Paint and blue ink. Shading with purple will contrast the blue really nicely. I make sure to hit all of the lowest points on the model. Now that he's all shaded, I could start with the base coat. For the base coat, I'm going to be using some Magic Blue Speed Paint from Army Painter. This is my favorite blue paint to use because of its vibrance. The Brachydios hide is made to retain moisture to build up its slime mold colonies. It may shed its outer layers over time on its arms and horn to prevent buildups of damaged tissue from continuous explosions. The Brachydios design is inspired from bombardier beetles, which actually have explosive defenses, and ceratopsian dinosaurs like the Triceratops. I'm going to use some Cloudburst Blue Speed Paint because I want to color the tail a bit darker than the rest of the body. The Brachydios tail is designed to resemble a mace, but it is also assumed to be used as a counterweight to support its heavy body. I'm also going to use some of this darker blue to add a bit more shading to some of the deepest shadows. Now I can coat the underside of the model with a mix of hardened leather and white ink. This will make a nice smooth tan color for the underbelly. I make sure to cover anything that is still unpainted. Now the model is fully base coated, and it's time to move on to the smaller details. I paint the tongue with AK Magenta. I didn't realize while I was recording, but my lamp got in the way of some of this. Now that his tongue is coated, I'm going to use some AK Deep Red on his eyes. Next, I coat all of his claws and toenails with anthracite gray. Then I mix in some white and dry brush all of the nails. Then I paint some AK Wine Red on the inside of his mouth. I'm going to be using some UV resin mixed with neon paint for the slime. I start with some glow-in-the-dark green paint. I stipple it all over his horn and forelimbs. I make sure to get as much coverage as possible. I also added some to his mouth. He's already looking pretty slimy, but he could use some color variation. I highlight all the slime with AK Fluorescent Green. This fluorescent paint is UV reactive, so it will glow bright when it's hit with a black light. Now I mix up the paints with the resin. I then apply it with a stir stick, trying to string it across. I make sure to apply as much as I can to the arms, horn, and mouth. The Brachydios slime changes colors to indicate the stages of detonation. Green is safe, yellow is unstable, and red is ready to detonate. Although Brachydios is a brute wyvern, its threat level is often compared to some elder dragons and can possibly contest with a few of them. I make sure to apply some resin in and around the mouth. I cured the resin and wanted to add some highlights. I lightly stipple all of the slime with AK fluorescent yellow. Now that the base is dried, it's time to apply some paint. I start by heavily dry brushing the entire base with burnt umber paint. I highlighted with a lighter dry brush of Liquitex Red Oxide. For a final ashy highlight, I used some grimy gray from AK Interactive. I then used some more gray to dry brush all the bones. Once all of the bones are highlighted, I'm going to apply a wash. I'm going to apply pallid bone speed paint all over the bones for a more realistic look. Now, these bones are starting to look grimy. This is how it looks so far. All that's left are the crystals. I'm going to start by overbrushing AK Deep Blue all over the crystals. Next, I'm going to airbrush some white ink on all of the flat surfaces. Now, I glue all of the crystals in place. Now, it's time to attach the star of the show. Luckily, he fits perfect in the center. I applied some more of the UV slime mixture around where he's standing. Then I shined the UV light over the whole thing for a few minutes until everything was cured. For a nice clean look, I added some black fleece lining the outer edges. I then trimmed up any excess fabric. The final step is to paint all of the edges black. And with that, Brachydios is complete. Thank you for watching.